Hey everyone, and welcome to the second in the two-part series on theories of cognitive development. Today we're going to be talking about Vygotsky's sociocultural cognitive theory and thinking about the ways in which it sort of compares and contrasts to the Piaget theory that we talked about the other day. So with cognitive development, and when we discussed Piaget's theory in relation to cognitive development, Piaget really held that biological and cognitive development occurred uh, before learning could occur. Excuse me. And so there were others, though, that fundamentally disagreed with this, and they believed that learning could, in fact, occur and spur on biological changes that were taking place. And one of these theorists was a Soviet psychologist by the name of Lev Vygotsky. And Lev Vygotsky actually was doing a lot of his work on cognitive development in the time either concurrently with Piaget or even a little bit before Piaget. The unfortunate part is that Lev Vygotsky died before his work was well known. He died when he was 40 years old or so. And Lev Vygotsky, because he's also living in the Soviet Union, his work does not get out to the mass public as quickly. And so when in the late 70s, when a lot of his work starts to come out, it stands in a lot of ways stark contrast to the work of Piaget, because he believed that learning precedes and promotes mental and cognitive development. And this became known again as the sociocultural cognitive theory. So this is based on a few different elements, and we're going to talk about all of these in greater detail in a second here. But the first one is the zone of proximal development. Uh, the second one is that high quality teaching and interaction with other students enriches the zone of proximal development. This, working with other students helps push our learning further, and it enhances the learning, which in turn promotes mental development and progress towards these higher end skills. The third is the role of the teacher is to scaffold, and we'll talk about what this means for the student, or take into consideration what they would need for supports. And then number four, social interaction with more skilled and experienced individual allows the learner to acquire the cultural tools necessary in their society. Number five, language is vital to the learning process. And then number six, the spiral curriculum. So we're going to start off talking about Bandura 1961 to think about some of these things, because in a lot of ways, Bandura is also saying that learning occurs, even though, the thing that the children in this experiment are learning is to bash a Bobo doll, and they're learning aggression and those sorts of things. But we can use the lessons from Bandura for good as well, because the social learning theory, again, aimed to demonstrate that learning can occur through mere observation of a model, which sounds very close to what I just said about the thinkings and theories of Lev Vygotsky. So again, they split 36 boys and 36 girls aged 3 to 6. A lot of them either observed a male or female model that were showing aggression towards the inflated Bobo doll, and then some saw a non-aggressive adult. And after viewing the models, all groups were put into a room full of toys. In some of the cases, the toys were taken away, saying that they were for other children, and they were only given the Bobo doll. And so it showed that those exposed to aggression at the earlier stage ended up showing, again, significantly more aggression. And if you're, connecting this to Vygotsky, you're going to want to also make the additional point that the learning in this case doesn't need to be aggression, but that it was socially learned, that observation did teach the kids something, even if in this case it's negative. So again, these strengths, it does appear to support social learning theory, it does have ecological validity. There are some limitations that you can see there, and we've talked about before. So the first thing, other than just general stuff with Bandura, that I want to talk about Vygotsky, is the idea of the zone of proximal development. And this is the area between what the child can achieve without help and what they can achieve when stretched by an educator or fellow student, right? With help who has more knowledge and skills. And it is the learning process that occupies the zone of proximal development and creates mental growth because you are being challenged in this case. So as the child's learning progresses, so does the zone of proximal development. What it was at one time challenging is now not challenging enough. And so that continues to grow as the child continues to challenge themselves and be stretched by either a teacher or a fellow student or their parents. And then high quality teaching and interaction with other students again enriches this zone of proximal development, right? So it promotes mental development, progress towards higher end skills. So here we see a picture of the zone of proximal development. Here's where you currently are, where you can work unassisted on stuff, but you always sort of want to live in a lot of ways in this area, because what this does is that this teal area then becomes purple and this out of reach becomes teal, and we can go further than we ever thought possible. There are going to be some things, though, that even with the help of others, you can't understand. If you just decided, or if your teacher decided to try and teach you calculus in the first grade, you are like 50 steps behind where you should be in order to understand that level of rigor with calculus. And so you have to sort of find that middle ground as a teacher in terms of cognitive development to make sure that you are challenging the students and giving enough challenge and giving enough support as well. Now, as far as scaffolding goes, really Vygotsky believed that the skilled teacher was one that broke down a new concept into a series of skills or tasks and structured units, which made it easier for the student to grasp. So earlier in the year with the IA, if I just came in the first day, slapped it down on your guys' desk what you needed to do and gave no other instructions than that, I would say that we'd be in trouble as a class in terms of passing our IA. And so the process again would go from a lot of help to a decreasing amount of help as well. And so scaffolding allows the child to receive more aid so that frustration can reduce, lowering the likelihood that the child has misconceptions or will give up. As far as social interaction and learning goes, high quality and constant social interaction with more skilled, this again is a important thing. You don't want to sort of always be around people who are at the same level or at lower levels of understanding than you. You want to be challenged. You want to continue to challenge yourself. And this enables the learner to learn the skills necessary to survive in society. And it can be different for each culture. Again, going back to the sociocultural idea. And so this could include things like having computer literacy and interacting with high quality and more skilled individuals in those fields in order to be able to interact in a globalized society. Now, as far as high quality instruction, we go back to the ideas of Rosenthal and Jacobson from 1968. So the aim was to investigate whether students of whom greater intellectual growth is expected will actually show greater intellectual growth in a period of 1 year or less. So they took 320 students from the same public high school, not a high school, from the same public school, grades 1 to 6, 65 were in the experimental group, and they told teachers that certain students were expected to grow in intellectual ability on the basis of an IQ test. So what they did, and the results of it, were that those that had greater expectations put on themselves gained 27.4 IQ points. And this is not necessarily based on their own biological potential. They grew more because they were challenged more, right? Imagine if all the kids in the school were challenged more. And so in connection to Vygotsky, what we can conclude is that, really asking ourselves the question of, did the different expectations for what students could do change the level of rigor that the teachers put students through, and change the trajectory of their cognitive growth, right? That's an important idea to think about. As far as Nedospasova from 1985 goes, this was an additional experiment where they sort of took Piaget's 3 mountains task, and they tested children ages 5 to 7 in a repeated measures design, where there was a little bit of a different twist, right? So the aim of the experiment was to investigate whether play can speed up overcoming cognitive egocentrism, and see whether, enriching environments could really help change children of whom maybe they wouldn't be stage ready or of age to go through that stage under Piaget's theory. So the child was given the 3 mountains task, and the child who did not pass the test for cognitive egocentrism were then presented with 3 dolls and told that they were all brothers. And the child was then asked to identify which one of the dolls, or with one of the dolls, and name it and ask how many brothers the doll had, which was 2. Another doll was then chosen, and the child had to answer how many brothers the doll had. And cognitively egocentric children would say only 1, right? And the child was prompted until they were giving the correct answer. And so this procedure ended up becoming repeated 2 more times, with graphical representations instead of dolls, and then one with verbal prompts. So the real heart of the matter here is that children who participated in this procedure were much more likely to pass the 3 mountains task afterwards with little or no help. And so scaffolding in the doll experiment really allowed for growth here, right, based on Vygotsky's theory. And so these results sort of supported Vygotsky's view that cognitive development in children is driven by interactions with more knowledgeable others, as well as the concept of the zone of proximal development. Now, language and learning is also an important factor in the learning process. Oftentimes, this can be age-based, so before age 3, oftentimes children's speech is public and is addressed to others. That's why you probably don't want to tell a little kid something because they're just going to yell it out. But at age 3, their speech can begin to become private. And so this is when thinking and talking converge, where their language growth is continued. And by 3, the child also uses the language learned in talking to themselves and thinking things through. This can include verbally talking to yourself and thinking to yourself. I know for myself, I still talk to myself. If I'm thinking through something, I'm trying to process something, those sorts of things. And so our thoughts are often shaped by the degree of sophistication and cultural aspects of the language that the child has learned through interaction with others. Lots of interaction with others in this theory. Very important point there. Now, as far as language and learning, by age 7, the thinking process ends up going underground as inner speech. Oftentimes we start going through ideas without having to necessarily think through them fully, but also not talking them out. And then language and culture continue to shape our thinking, like we've seen with enculturation studies, but speech is for the purpose of communicating with others and not usually ourselves. As we see with the Daffy Duck thing, this doesn't necessarily always go away though. As far as modes of representation goes, Jerome Bruner, who was another psychologist, ended up coming up with something called the mode of representation model. So this is the ways in which knowledge and understanding are encoded and stored in the memory. So it had 3 stages. The first one was the inactive representational stage, where mental encoding of a concept is based on the physical action of repeating the image or learning, right? So if you continue to repeat it over and over and over in your mind, you are in the inactive representational stage. And luckily, we are able to access this from birth. Now, the thing I want to point out about these stages is that even though you can go into a new stage, you can still act in ways and think in ways that are representational of earlier stage. So, for instance, once you move into the iconic representational stage, you may still think in some ways in the inactive representational stage. All right, with the iconic representational stage, the concept forms a picture in the mind which represents that concept, right? So this becomes accessible in the first couple years of life. What ends up happening is, like, when you're reading, you end up coming up with this concept in your mind of what's going on. And so this is representational of the iconic representational stage. Then at about age 7, we move into or we can access a stage called the symbolic representational stage. And so encoding becomes based on more complex codes in the form of flexible to apply language or mathematics. So each stage, again, is translatable to each other as each person goes through each of the 3 stages when encoding and strengthening memories. And so this adds to what Vygotsky was saying in terms of language and learning and development cognitively. Now, one of the last ideas from Vygotsky here is the idea of the spiral curriculum. So this includes revisiting previously encountered concepts repeatedly at more complex levels, making the learning an upward climb. And this can apply to every learner. So, if we're looking at the differences between Vygotsky and Piaget, the sociocultural cognitive theory claims that any learner can learn material as long as it is organized in a way that is scaffolded appropriately, revisited in this case, and developed in a high quality and suitably stimulating learning environment. Now, in terms of where Vygotsky is used, this really revolutionized the idea of schooling, because before this, we were holding kids within certain boxes based on the ideas of Piaget. And so things like the zone of proximal development becomes a good practice of group collaboration in the classroom. And so group collaboration started to increase, and it was much less of a sit in your seats sort of schooling existence, even though that obviously still exists in a lot of forms. And then the use of scaffolding to present a complex concept is used consistently, right? Finding relevant items that individuals have heard of to represent an image or concept in order to grow learning. Also, devising programs of learning that build on previously learned concepts and then also revisiting those concepts are part of the spiral curriculum. And most ways that we organize schooling is based on this idea. Like, you've probably revisited the American Revolution several times. Once in 1st grade, once in 4th grade, once in 7th or 8th grade, once in high school, or twice in high school. These are ways in which you can continue to revisit these concepts, continue to grow in your knowledge of those concepts, and add to your schemas and knowledge of those concepts. So a few strengths of Vygotsky's theory. So to a great extent, it does free the educational process from the age restraints from Piaget. The zone of proximal development can allow learning to push the individual further. It also stresses how the learning process can be sped up through good teaching and purposeful learning interaction with peers. It also addresses the means of creating suitable educational and social environments for advancing higher ability children, and it's highly influential in ed policies and practices. As far as limitations, though, much of this is theoretical. It has not been tested in terms of empirical research as much as Piaget. Again, Vygotsky died at 38, close to 40. And then it also places heavy emphasis on social interaction and places relatively little emphasis on underlying biological processes like Piaget. And then the model also incorporates the importance of verbal instruction as part of the ZPD, but this may be less effective than observation and practice. And so verbal interaction may work better in some cultures as well than others. All right, if you have any questions over Piaget or Vygotsky in terms of how they differ, please let me know. And other than that, have a great day.